we were on a trip in South Dakota visiting our family, and we spent a little bit of time with my aunt who lives in South Dakota. One day she drove out to where we were staying to spend part of the day with us. And when she got out there, we had a little extra time before the activity that we were doing that day started. And so she motioned to me, come over to my car. So I did. I went over to her car, and she opened up the back, and she had a huge overstuffed file folder and a box. And so she brought that out, and she said, let's go over here to this picnic table and let's sit down. So we sat down, and she started opening up this file folder with pictures and maps and papers and all sorts of old stuff. And she just started narrating and telling the story of our family. She started telling me about our ancestors 5 or 6 generations ago who had immigrated to the United States. And she started telling about how they came from Europe and they came into the United States through the St. Lawrence River, and they ended up settling in a town in Canada, in Ontario. My great-great-great-grandfather, something like that, sometime back in then, was a watchmaker. And so he brought his profession of watchmaking to this area across the ocean, and he made a living so that our family back then could be able to stay. They settled in a town in Ontario, Canada called Hastings, Ontario, a little town across the water from Niagara Falls. They were there for a number of years, decades, a generation, I don't know, some amount of time, and eventually they moved southwest into the United States. They moved down into Indiana and Illinois and that area, and he continued being a watchmaker in that profession. A while later, the family moved again, and they tried their hand at farming. They homesteaded some land in the Nebraska area, and they quickly realized that they were not farmers. So they gave that up and gave the land to somebody else in the family, and they continued to settle in a town in central Nebraska where they took up some other professions. They took up furniture sales, and they took up offset printing and typesetting that was needed in that town. And that town was called Hastings, Nebraska. And it was just so cool hearing that they settled in Hastings, Ontario, and they made their way down to Nebraska, and they settled in Hastings, Nebraska. And for me, that struck a chord, because that's where my dad was born, where my dad grew up, and that's where we visited when we were kids to see my grandparents. So Hastings all of a sudden made sense, and I linked up my life with theirs, and I thought, oh, okay, now I get how my life impacts theirs and how they came to Nebraska. My parents then moved on to California, and so I figured out how my life was part of their life. And as I'm listening to these stories that my aunt was telling me that I'd never heard before, about people that I had no idea who they were, but they shared the last name, I realized, I'm part of them. I'm part of their story. I get now what they were doing, and I see how I am carrying on this journey or this thing that they started a long, long time ago, and now I'm seeing how I'm part of that. So as my aunt was telling these stories, I couldn't help but feeling more and more connected to my family. Like somehow I was part of them, and what they did now impacts who I am. I saw a few ways that we resembled each other. I saw kind of who I am and my family history, and it's like they were part of my journey and I'm kind of part of theirs. I started feeling some of the challenges that they felt. I started feeling like this pioneering spirit that they went on to come all the way here, and now I was picking up that charge, and I just felt so much more a part of the family. One of the biggest moments in the Bible, in the Old Testament, was when God led God's people into the Promised Land. And it had been built up for decades and centuries. Promise after promise God made that this would happen, and it was finally that moment in the Bible when people were standing at the banks of the Jordan River, and Moses recounts all the steps they had taken before to get to there. And they took a ton of steps to move for years and years to get to that place. It actually took a lot more steps than it should have taken, because the book of Deuteronomy describes that the people of Israel were at Mount Sinai, where the Ten Commandments were given, and did was travel to the Jordan River in this promised land, and that journey should have taken 11 days. Instead, it took 40 years. They took a lot of steps during those 40 years. And the whole book of Deuteronomy, this 40-page book about 40 years of history, recounts all the steps that these people took to go from the big moment of Mount Sinai to the big moment when God was going to lead his people, and all the steps that happened in between. And I love the book of Deuteronomy because it describes all the prayers, all of the mistakes, all of the blessings, all of the really exciting times, all of the awful times. It recounts them all so that people don't forget all the steps that people before them took to get there. We've taken a lot of steps to get to here. Celebrating 2 years is a huge deal. And there are at least 2 years of steps that have been taken, if not more. I actually think there's probably 3 years of steps that have been taken to get to here. It was exactly 3 years ago this month, August of 2014, that Kimberly and I took this strange step of restarting a conversation that had happened before. We had been dodging this conversation for 3 months. We had been avoiding at all costs talking about this. We were trying to get it out of our minds and forget about it, and it just wouldn't leave our minds. So when we got back from a break, we called up the Ogletrees and we called up the Bounds, and we said, you remember when we talked last May about this whole crazy idea of starting a church? Well, we can't stop thinking about it, and we can't get it out of our minds. So we need to get together and we need to talk about that. So we did. And that's when more people than just us took a step. A group of families took a step, and we started intentionally discerning whether God was calling us to start a church. And so what we did is we started meeting every Sunday night. For 9 months, we met every Sunday night, trying to invent a way of figuring out what is God doing and what is God calling us to. We worshiped, we prayed, we dreamed, we walked through neighborhoods, we read books and articles, we talked with people, we served, we planned, we organized, we scheduled things, we laughed, we nervously and cautiously threw out ideas, and we cried because we had no idea what we were doing. And when we were as sure as we could be that God was leading us to start a church, that was Memorial Day weekend of 2015. And that's when we held our first retreat. And quite a number of you were there at that retreat, Memorial Day weekend of 2015. And that's when even more of us took a step. And we took a step to together try to figure out, adults, children, students, everybody who was there, try to figure out where is God leading us and what does this crazy church look like that God is calling us to start. So we played games, we laughed, we talked, the kids did a skit that they created themselves, we planned and organized, we prayed, and we planned and we assigned roles. We tried to discern the shape of what this church was going to look like. And we came away from that weekend with lots and lots of things, pages and pages of ideas. But we came away with a few convictions. And we were convinced and convicted that this church needed to do things together. You know, we had all had past experiences and we had all been shaped by those, but we were convinced that at least this church needed to do things together. We didn't want to isolate or separate each other. We wanted to do things together, and that's why we worship together. We worship together because we believe that we help each other understand who Jesus is. The ideas of somebody who's 90 and somebody who's 2 are helpful to understand how God works and God speaks. So we want to do things together so that we are all experiencing Jesus together. We also were convinced that we need to make church worthwhile. And I know that sounds strange, but shouldn't church be worthwhile? Well, of course it should. but we were convinced that we had to intentionally think about, plan, and organize and do things so that church is worthwhile. Because if we're going to do this, let's make it worth it. Let's not just do it to do it. Let's make this worthwhile. And if we're going to be crazy enough to start a church, well, let's make sure it's worth doing and it's worth spending our time on. We also were convinced that we needed to involve everyone. We didn't just want 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people doing everything as though they're the only people who can do anything in the church. That's why we have a worship board. That's why we invite everybody to participate in everything, and it takes everybody to do everything. We are the church, and it usually doesn't happen. Normally it's just a couple of people doing things, but we wanted everybody to be involved in everything that we do. So when we kind of came away with some of these ideas, we were convinced that, okay, this is becoming more real. This church is gelling. It's sort of taking on a flavor. But we didn't have any concrete steps. In fact, we didn't know when we were starting the church. So we took a big calendar and we unrolled it and we spread it across the room. And this was a calendar for 3 or 4 months. And we decided, let's put down some dates. And of course, the burning question was, when do we start? When do we say we're starting to publicly worship? We're starting to hold worship services. When do we actually start? And for me, I was thinking, okay, we're Memorial Day. This is the end of May. We got a lot to plan. We got a lot to organize. We got a lot to do. We got to figure out a whole lot of details about how we want to worship. And if we want it to be worthwhile and everybody involved, that's going to take a lot of effort and figure out how to do it. So, August. August sounds good. That gives us 2 full months to plan and figure this out before we have a worship service. And so we posed the question, when are we going to start? And the discussion was really short. And so we started 2 weeks later. And it was amazing, because the Ogletrees opened their backyard, and we had a couple of worship services in the Ogletrees' backyard. And it was hot, and it was outside. Everybody brought their chair, and it was a little noisy. There was some traffic now and then. We set up some shade tents to try to minimize the heat. And it didn't look like a traditional church building, but nobody complained. Because we were worshiping, and we were doing what God was calling us to do. We were starting this thing. And if God called us to it, and we were doing it, then it was worthwhile. And people were involved, and we were together. We were seeing that we were doing all the things that we've been convinced of. We were starting this church. When the book of Deuteronomy ends, it leaves the people of Israel standing at the edge of the Jordan River. They're ready to step into the promised land that God has said, go into. And they've spent a long time hearing Moses recount all these steps that people have taken before them to get to that point. They've heard it all. They've heard the good steps, the bad steps, all the different steps that have been taken. And for them, this was like Victory Day. Because for generations, people have been talking about the day when God leads you there, the day when God brings you into this beautiful land. I mean, it had been built up for a long time. And they were living this dream. They were finally there. But there was a problem. And the problem was that there was a river in the way. And it wasn't just a trickle of a river, it was a flooded river. Because the flooded river, it was during flood season, during harvest season, and the river was enormous. Whereas you normally could have waded right across, during flood season it could have been up to a mile across. This picture was from 1935, during flood season, to show what the Jordan River looks like in certain places during flood season. And the people of Israel are standing near this river, looking at this river, looking beyond it into the promised land, and they had to be thinking, we're going where? And how? And so that's when the book of Joshua describes. Joshua and all the Israelites arrived at the banks of the Jordan River. Joshua told the Israelites, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe. The priests will carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth. As soon as their feet touch the water, the flow of water will be cut off upstream, and the river will stand up like a wall. So the people left their camps across the Jordan, and the priests who were carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. It was the harvest season, and the Jordan was overflowing its banks. But as soon as the feet of the priests who were carrying the Ark touched the water at the river's edge, the water above that point began backing up a great distance away, and the water below that point flowed on until the riverbed was dry. Then all the people walked across. Now, picture this. When these people were in their camp, wherever that was, up the hill, and they're seeing all this land and this river, they see a big river. And God says these things. The river's still flooded. The priests are walking toward the river, and the river's still flooded. Everybody gets up to the edge of the river. Is the river still flooded? It's still flooded. It's not until they step into the river that it stops flooding. All the way up to that point, it had flooded. But it wasn't until they stepped in that God worked. Now, what do you call the people of Israel at that moment? Crazy? Freaked out? Faithful? Obedient? Doubtful? I bet there were some. Scared? What if we called them church? Because that's what a church is. It's people who follow God when God says step in. For generations, for a long time, for centuries, the church that Jesus called into being is people who just try to follow when God says step in. Sometimes it's faithful, sometimes it's not, but it's still church. Step in to trust God with everything. Step in to ask God when things get tough. Step in to have that awkward conversation. Step in to love people who are hard to love. Step into worship. Step into relationships with people. Step into different routines. Step into new habits. Step into starting new routines. Step into meeting somebody new. Step into offering to pray with somebody. Step into meeting in a new place. Step into trying something you've never tried before. Step into asking God for wisdom and trusting that God will give it. The church's job is to step in when God says, step in. And that's what we felt like in spring of 2015 with RiverCross. Even though it seemed totally impossible to start a church, God said step in. And so together we figured out, how do we step in? And we did. And the church started. And when we stepped in, God worked. When we step in, God does the impossible. None of us could have started a church by ourselves. This was God's plan and God's design and God's mission. All we did was step in. That's our job. When we step in, that's when God does the impossible. About 15 years ago, before wearable tech was the trend, I bought Kimberly a pedometer. Remember those things you clip to your belt and it has like a little screen and a little thing that folds down and has a rocker in it? That when you swing your leg, it actually counts a step. It doesn't have a microchip, it's just a rocker. And I bought one of these things, and we went on lots of walks. And so I bought one of these, to count steps. And it's a cool thing. Well, now, of course, they're all GPS-based, and they track electronically everything, including when you sleep and how deeply you sleep. It's a little frightening. And all the things that it counts. But there are lots of different types of these pedometers. The first mass-market pedometer was developed in 1965. And this was the year after the Olympics were in Japan. And what happened was that people caught on to this rage of exercise after the Olympics. And so this guy in Japan developed what he called the Manpo-K, however you pronounce it. And in the U.S., this was called a Manpo-meter. But in Japanese, it's Manpo-Ki or Manpo-K. He named it that because when you translate Manpo, whatever, into English, it literally means 10,000 steps meter. And this is the guy who made the 10,000 step goal, like the goal of everybody. You know, if you have a good day, it's a 10,000 step day. You know, I got to get my steps in. I got to get 10,000 steps. That's sort of, the ultimate goal. That's a good exercise day. He is the man who invented 10,000 steps as the good day. And I love pedometers and GPS things like this because they do. They count our steps and they help us understand how many steps we've taken. But what about the steps we haven't yet taken? What counts those? Because there are lots of steps we have yet to take. You know, when God said step in, and they crossed the river, the Israelites, into the promised land, was that the last step that God called Israel to take? No, there's a Bible full of steps that God called them to take. And when we celebrate 2 years, we're celebrating an amazing amount of steps that have happened up to now. And is this the last step God's calling us to take? Is this the last step God's calling us to take? Yes! Okay, that's what I like. So where's God calling us to step? I don't know. But we get to figure it out. One thing I'm certain of is this. I have loved this Big Picture series. What do we call this thing? Big Picture series that we've been in all year. I've loved it because every event and every story in the Bible and everything that we've looked at, no matter if it's in Genesis or in Matthew or in the middle of the Old Testament somewhere, it seems like every story seems to point to the same thing. That God wants this one big thing for us. That God has fought for this one thing and God has planned for this one thing as God paves the way for this one thing. What's that one thing that God so wants for us? Help me out, somebody. A relationship. I mean, God created you and me to have a relationship with Him. And no matter what happens, God fights for it, and God works for it. God makes a way for you and me to have a relationship with Him. And this seems to stand out throughout the Bible. No matter what we look at, it seems that God is screaming, be in a relationship with me. Come back to a relationship with me. You know, the 10 Commandments talk about a relationship with God and a relationship with other people. Jesus, when He was asked what's the most important commandment, He gave 2 answers. He said, love God and love others. Relationship. I mean, it's all over the Bible. There's events and there's stories and things about a relationship with Him and a relationship with others. If we step into anything, we need to step into a deeper relationship with God and a deeper relationship with people. I mean, God is all about it. We can't escape it. We can't get away from it. It is all about relationships. And that's even why we talk about the church the way we do. That's why we have these shirts, that say, worship, connect, and serve. We have it because that's how we talk about the relationships that God is forming among us. We worship, relationship with God. We connect, relationship with each other. We serve, relationship with more people. I mean, it's all about relationships. So what if we each and we all stepped in to a relationship with God in a deeper way and a relationship with people in a deeper way? One step in each. What if we stepped into a relationship with God and a relationship with other people? Could be just a different habit. Could be a different routine. Could be doing something differently. Could be getting rid of something. Could be meeting somebody new. Could be saying, I'm going to get to know my 4 neighbors. Could be, I don't know. But what step could each of us and us together take to deepen a relationship with God and a relationship with each other and other people. If we step into that, we're the church.